This hangout on here is live, so no more talking about Rick Wakeman. Hello, everybody. Hello, world. So, today you have got myself, Alan Richardson. We've got James Lyndsay, Steve Green, and Tony Bruce, and we are the Black Ops testing team. And you can find us at blackopstesting.com. And today we're going to discuss the testing that we performed on Tracks, which is a getting things done application, which we used in our recent face-to-face workshop. So because it was a workshop, we're not going to give away all the secrets of what we did, but we are going to talk about how we approached the testing, tools we used, how we did the prep, some things we found, and how other people approached it. So what we tested was Get on Tracks, which is a getting things done application written in Ruby on Rails. It has got a web front end. It has got a mobile web front end. It has got a REST API. It's got a database. And what else has it got?
It's got a lot of public contributors on the web because it's open source. It's got, I mean, we basically did kind of functionality. It's got a whole bunch of logs that you can tune into. It's got some different ways of installing it. I've lost my notes, but never mind. I don't know if you can hear that going on behind me. That's also bedtime.
So what all that means is, essentially, we had an application that we could approach in lots of different ways. So we could approach it technically from all the different interface points. We could approach it from the business viewpoint in terms of its GTD functionality and its business personas. Or we could approach it from the functionality that each of those interfaces presented to us. So we had a fairly rich approach to how we might have tested this and gone about testing this. One of the questions that was asked during the workshop is how do we find these applications? Because we test a lot of these things. And this one was one of the ones listed on Bitnami. Because one of the things I like to look for are applications that we can install with a virtual machine, pre-built virtual machine, because then it's nice and easy. But we can also install it from source. I think James installed it from source. And when it's on Bitnami, we can easily upload it to Amazon and have it on the cloud. So we've got a whole bunch of different interface points for how we can actually use this application. I mean, so I generally did my testing from a virtual machine because the same virtual machines can run on Mac and Windows, making it easy for me. I can run it on Mac whilst testing it from Windows because it's a web interface. Steve, you primarily tested it on one of James's instances, is that right?
I did, yes.
And James, how did you go about setting one of those up? You're on mute, you're on mute, you're on mute.
I'm on mute, yes, I'm mute now. Well, I tried lots of different ways because I just was kind of one of the things I wanted to do was play with Docker. Docker's neat. It's like a virtual machine but doesn't include the operating system, so all your virtual machines think the application thinks it's virtual, but actually it shares an operating system but nothing else. So I tried going on Docker, but I really wanted it working on my own machine. And the reason I wanted it working on my own machine was I wanted to be able to use a couple of tools to look at the database. I wanted to be able to get at the logs exactly where I could get at them. I wanted to be able to hear the fans spin up if it went a bit hard, not think that it was the virtual machine that was having a problem. So I wanted it running on my own box. And that took me into a bunch of different directions once I'd got fed up of trying to go through the various sliding doors of getting into Docker.
Yeah, because it's interesting. With this type of setup, one of the things that's really important for testers is to have as much control over their environment as they can. And a lot of the time when you're testing stuff, you don't have any of that. So out of all the ways that you tried, James, which gave you most control?
I'm going to draw a line between most control over what the thing was doing and most control over what I could see. Does that make sense? So if I wanted something with ultimate control over the configuration of this thing, I'd have gone for a virtual machine. and I'd have probably gone for a Docker-style virtual machine because you can kind of install. You put layers of base install working, then you can stick a layer of data on it. You can take that layer off and go back and try other data out. So I would probably try Docker or a virtual machine if I wanted complete control over how the thing itself was doing stuff. But I'm an observing kind of person, so I want control over what I can the application. So that's why I want it running locally. So there are two different things I wanted there. And I'll give you, for instance, about Docker. To get to the logs on Docker involved SSHing into one virtual machine and then into the next virtual machine that was running inside it before I could ever see the logs themselves, which was difficult. I only got it going, I think, on the day of the workshop or the day before or the day after. That's not what you want. If you want to see what it's doing, you want to see the logs, thank you very much. And you want to not just tail them, you want to take the whole file and you want to muck about with it. I want to open it up in TextMate because TextMate shows me things, because it does syntax highlighting, etc., etc. So if I wanted control over all the triggering, I'd have gone for a virtual machine, but as it was, I chose to control my observing a bit more differently. So I went for it installed on my own box, and as it happens, I seem to have it installed in 2 or 3 different places on my own box, which introduces a whole different set of control issues.
That's interesting. I'm not sure what you did differently, because it's supposed to be really easy to install and comes with its own web server.
Yeah, well, you'd have thought that, wouldn't you? I think that it has its own web server was okay, and when its own web server was working, that was fine. But getting the web server to actually work and not conflict with another web server I was running was a bit difficult. It was for a time, and this is a known bug when you go and you find out what it does with certain installations. It was happily serving me content, but no layout. So it wasn't picking up the CSS or any other assets. That turns out to be partly because you have to, once you get this thing running, you have to, I think the term is compile a Rails application. Now Ruby's interpreted, I think, rather than compile. Stop me if I'm being an idiot, but there's not a lot of compiling you do with Ruby stuff. And you have to recompile the assets for a Rails app. And if you don't recompile them and relink them and have them in all the right places, it doesn't do what you expect to do. So I didn't have all the I's dotted and T's crossed for the assets. And that meant that it was serving me all the information, but none of the layout. So, it was just Times New Roman and black text on a white background, and the menu was up here, and the text was down here. It was just so. It became a bit difficult. I have to say that since playing with that, I found a couple of neat tools which I will share with you here, one of which is PAL. PAL comes from people who rather, I won't say deviously, but I have. They say, from the people who bought you Basecamp. Well, the people who bought you Basecamp are 37 Signals, who wrote a dismal book on development, and I'm a very, very long-standing Basecamp customer, and I'm completely fed up with the number of bugs in it, and I know that Basecamp is the reference application for Rails. So finally, the guys from Basecamp have released, very quietly, something called PAL, which says it will virtualize the Rails environment for you on your Mac. And I want that, because it's a pain in the ass that I had setting this thing up. So PAL, and then something called Shipio, xip.io. Those two working together would be what I would use next time round if I really wanted to sort of get the environment on my own machine working. As it was, when I got it all, the first thing I did, you get it installed, you get it downloaded rather, and you go into the environment, you look through all the files, you have a think about it, and then you try and get it running, and you run something called bundle, and bundle, of course, goes off and gets lots of things down. And bundle installs lots of dependencies, lots of things that it is dependent on, and has almost certainly stuffed other things up on my machine, because it gave me lots of warnings about things it was going to stuff. So it stuffed them. Hence, I'd be using something else next time around, because it was fewer things. So yes, in terms of my testing machine, currently, Rails works. So not Rails works, Trax works, or at least it did until recently. But basically, it's whatever I installed last will work, because that's got the most recent dependencies. So.
That's why I like virtual machines.
Yeah, it's a lot cleaner.
It's just that with the Bitnami, you have to open up ports and sometimes enable the different parts that are not there by default. So you have to open up the SSH, you have to open up FTP. I think I had to stick an FTP server on one of the Bitnami ones in order to get the access that I wanted. So when you were testing, Steve, and you were using James's machine, what access did you need?
Right, I kept it simple. So all of my testing was through the UI, and I never looked at any of the stuff at the back end at all, even when I hit problems. So I just told you guys what I'd found and left it to you to go and look at why things were happening. So that kind of made it easy. So there's nothing to do with idleness. I think it's just the context was we didn't have much time, so I focused on the stuff I could do easily.
Yeah, so this time, I mean, I normally try and look in the back end or in the database, but I didn't do any of that this time. Because I was reading some Feldenkrais books before. In fact, I've probably got... So I was reading this guy, Moshe Feldenkrais, who is a judo practitioner. I think he opened the first judo dojo in France or something back in the 50s or something. And then he became kind of a physical therapist type psychotherapist person. And there's no thing about it. And what he was saying was learning means having at least another way of doing the same thing. So, like Steve, I was basically trying to hit the API or the front end. And I know how to do that, but I looked for alternative ways of doing that. So I started with curl to hit the API, the REST API, just with HTTP requests. And I know that you've used curl quite a lot, James, haven't you?
No. I mean, yes, in the past I've used curl quite a lot, but no, not in this one, because I didn't. It's got a REST API, so I've got a thing called Cocoa REST Client, which is very straightforward and runs on a Mac and does what I want it to do, roughly. I think, having seen everybody in the workshop going, why aren't you using Postman? I'd use Postman now, because it's a lot better. Postman looks lovely. I'll have a play with Postman. But no, I used to roll my own. That's an odd thing to say. Roll my own curl. I used to roll my own curl things because you can do it in Excel. You know, you have a curl, and you've got a parameter, and you can concatenate it all together, and then you've got a stack of things that you extract and throw into a shell script. You execute a shell script, and things happen. It's lovely. But no, I didn't use any curl on this. Indeed, I spent an awful lot of time where you guys didn't. I spent a lot of time in the back end. I looked at what was in the code, what was in the databases. I spent actually quite a lot of time on GitHub seeing who'd changed what and why a certain thing that seemed to have very low coverage actually did have low coverage, and that kind of thing. So I was somewhere else from you guys and didn't do curl at all. When I did get to do the hands-on stuff, it did invite us, you may remember, to do something evil to it, this thing. So the first thing I did was to do the thing that was, it was sat there on the front screen saying, go on, beat me up. So I did that. And that rather informed some of the other things that I then saw was, of course, then I was working in an environment a bit beaten up. And that was the problem that I left you with, Steve, because the environment that I was working in, one of them being was on my laptop, but another few were on AWS. Those Bitnami instances were on AWS. And the place where I beat it up was on Steve's AWS instance, or rather the instance that I gave to Steve. So he had a difficult machine to work with. I think I kind of bombed it for you a bit, Steve.
Entirely, yeah.
Sorry, mate.
So I've always enjoyed working in companies that use AWS because it's so easy to spin up machines in test environments. But very often you discover that they give you the hardened test environment because it's AWS, so they want everything to be hardened and strengthened, and you don't have any access, even though you should have as much access as you want. And very often the virtual machines are not the same ones that you can run on AWS as you can off, which is why I like the Bitnami ones, because it's exactly the same setup.
I think the Docker would be an advantage there because it should be the same, and that's why it's interesting. It's coming out of an infrastructural side of things, so you tend to find Docker running in live, and then testers going, ooh, what's this Dockery thing? I can use that. So yeah, I didn't find anything particular with the Bitnami that led me to feel that it was hardened or not hardened, but it had things that were missing both in that and the Docker stuff. So I think Bitnami had SSH in, but Docker didn't. You really couldn't get into the Docker one. The Bitnami version didn't have anything that let me install any other tool. When I tried to do bundle for a coverage tool, for instance, I couldn't do it because the Bitnami thing didn't have bundle installed. So I had to have gone off and install the package manager before I could download a tool, and I thought this is a step too far. So I didn't. That's another reason to go.
Are basic. The Bitnami machines are very basic, which is good, makes them small, but unfortunately doesn't cut down on the download size. So you're still downloading a huge amount of megabytes and in a workshop bringing down the entire Wi-Fi, which is good.
So
Yes.
did anybody try
Would you please
Turnkey
don't
one?
Oh, the 780 megabyte then. Don't do that.
I missed that, Tony. What did you say?
So did I try the Turnkey one? So they have download VM Cloud as well. So maybe right, got it in.
Yeah, you've done it. I can't see more than that.
We talking about that.
Let me move forward. Is that any better?
We need to get an Uber app for Google Hangouts so Tony can talk to us properly.
We need to get Tony a line.
Well, again, kids, we're back. Right.
That was it.
Let's do act one.
Those are worse than the cheat. We'll be talking about that system.
Right. Any difference? Right. Awesome.
And I think you've got control of the mute button.
Hello.
Unfortunately, Tony has control over his mute button. We can talk over him and then cut out the sound, but that's as good as we get. So Tony's going to hit the chat room. That sounded wrong. So, so going back to Carl, right? One of the good things about Carl is that the documentation for Tracks explains its API in terms of Carl. So you can take the exact statements, copy them in, and they should run. Unfortunately, when people copy and paste it, they don't necessarily realize that they're copy and pasting, and they don't necessarily know which bits are part of the curl command and which are not, so they get syntax errors in it. But I find it really useful to learn curl from scratch and build some bash scripts around it to feed data into those small curl scripts and have kind of loose data-driven tests from it. But we did get onto Postman. Postman is a Chrome plugin, or essentially a Chrome app, which has a nice GUI, lets you build up a model of an API with calls that you can feed through. What I like about Postman is that you can share the models that you build up of the API to other people. So you can create a public version of it and then share that with other people on your team. What I disliked about Postman is that because it's running in Chrome, it sometimes picked up the session cookies that I had from other Chrome windows, and I thought I'd found a permission bug that I hadn't. And I wasted about 2 hours. I was looking through my notes today, and I wasted about 2 hours investigating a problem that didn't exist. I read James's notes, and it's good that we both have the same terminology. We both write down arg in our notes when something goes wrong. I like to see that. But Postman is good. Out of all the REST tools that I found that were browser plugins, that was the best one.
My Cocoa REST client had a different thing on the Mac. This is something that I knew about, so I tried to avoid it, but the Mac's got what people call a cookie jar. And if you've logged into something using Safari, but not Firefox or Chrome, then every authentication cookie that Safari's got is available to other applications. So your REST client will happily go in on a different authorization or on Safari's authorization, or will go in when you don't expect it to go in. So that was something I was avoiding with Cocoa REST client. It's definitely seems to be something that is perhaps not necessarily a shared bug, but yeah, authentication problems with REST clients where it does something the operating system is helping with. I think, and in Chrome that will be Chrome effectively as the OS because it's a Chrome application. I think it's just something to be aware of if you're not using them very often, as I'm not. That there can be cookie sharing going on.
And I think it only has to bite you once for a long time before you remember. So my workaround was always to send in a logout message, like a logout REST call before I started. Even though that's not part of the REST API, I put that in as part of my REST API just to hit the logout and to invalidate the session cookies and force it to start a new one. So in the chat, Tony has asked a question. Tony has said, did we try the Turnkey VM Cloud instances or did we go straight to Bitnami? So I went straight to Bitnami. Did you try Turnkey?
Yeah, I think I had one Turnkey out of my set, but everything else was Bitnami because I just basically chucked a whole bunch of AWSs in and see what would work, what would fly.
Yeah. So for people that don't know, Turnkey is another company that makes just pre-installed virtual machines with open source applications on it. It's a very useful thing to have a look at. Because remember, all these things are ways of being able to practice your testing in isolation. So someone else take over while all my phones in my room.
It's an alarm. Yeah, the test lab is. In the early days of the test lab, we used to do an awful lot of installing. We still do an awful lot of installing in the test lab, but we're leaning increasingly heavily on turnkey images because it makes life very easy. What turnkey images don't tend to come with is data. So you'll load something in there, add data, and then maybe keep an image of that around the place. And so all of these Trax instances we're talking about were Trax instances without any data in them. And then we were throwing data at that. Now, it's possible, particularly if we've got a few images, to say, well, I've got this kind of data over here and this kind of data over here, and move your testing around depending on what you're looking for. So that broken environment I gave to Steve, I might go in there if I wanted to see how things work with an awful lot of data being moved around from page to page, but I might not do most of my testing in there. I might just give that to Steve to do testing in.
So test data creation is also an important thing to consider. And that was one of the things I looked at. Did any of you guys look at test data creation?
The massive data that I put in was all labelled. So there's a free text field, and that was all labelled, so I knew which was where and whether it was going to be in order and what they were linked to. So that was the only bit of test data creation I did that was sort of explicit and bulky. It's something that I do kind of by force of habit, I think, is create lots of data to go in one chunk that's kind of refers to itself, so you can look at one record, whether it's in the database or on the screen, and you know what that record should have elsewhere because you've mucked around with the free text. But that was as close as I got that bulk design. Steve?
Yeah, this application I found challenging in terms of data. It's very easy to create lots of it through the API, but I deliberately created actually the smallest amount I could get away with because it's very difficult to see what's going on once there's a lot of data in there. So that's different from some applications we tested, like especially e-commerce systems where we might place tons and tons of purchases and things, and they all stay essentially separate from each other, and it's very easy to see what's going on. With this application, every screen just very rapidly got hugely complicated, and it was very difficult to tell when you ran a test, it was difficult to tell what happened, never mind whether the right thing happened. And the more data you had, the more difficult that problem got. So for that reason, I actually created very, very little data, and can totally see the benefit of having multiple environments where you do some big tests in one environment but do all your much more granular tests somewhere else where you can actually see what's going on.
It's one of the big advantages of having multiple environments, but yeah, it's kind of the nature of this particular application. Getting things done is a way of managing your to-do lists, and at the heart of getting things done is just one list. And that's all these entities that you've got in the database and all the things that it's doing ultimately point at one big list. And as soon as you put lots of data in, that's the big list it's gone into. There are a few things you can put in. I think it's had a concept of tags and contexts and projects, and you can put fewer of those in, and that might make life easy and interesting for doing your test data. But the nature of this application is to have one bloody great table, and as soon as you fill up that one bloody great table, it always does the same thing, which I think is a moot point. If you're getting things done, I don't know about you, but I'm currently 46, a father, a two, and a business owner, and I've got about 800,000 things on my mind at any one time, and even putting them into a machine might be difficult, but I swear as soon as I got all of those into an GTD, it would just grind to a halt, as indeed do I. So, it's one big list, and however you filter it, you're still filtering a bloody great list.
But you can delegate your just stuckness to the machine.
Yes,
so I did investigate.
It's the machine. That's why it's all going wrong.
So I did investigate test data setup in a bunch of ways. So I started with curl and started putting data in text files that I used the normal bash scripts to pull things out of and feed into the curl commands, which was a bit limiting. I had a look at JMeter, not as a performance test tool, but just as a way of setting up commands and repeating them through. But again, I found that the JMeter CSV file parsing was a little bit limited in terms of the data I wanted to set up, and I was starting to have a look at building Groovy scripts too much, so I moved away from that. What else did I look at? So I did build data setup scripts through the API in Java, but in order to get the data, instead of randomizing it completely, I went off to another site to kind of steal their data and then use that. So Wunderlist has public to-do lists, and I essentially screen scraped those and used those as my input data, which could have demonstrated some bugs around different data formats being supported by one app but not another, which might have been important. In the end, it demonstrated bugs in my automation code for transferring in different formats of data that I didn't investigate in too much detail. But that was a useful thing for me to know, that I need to get my head around the different data formats that are in place and control those a bit better, particularly for the automation side when you're working through APIs. Because the APIs often have a lot less control, and character sets is not something I've experimented with a lot.
The other side of that is what's actually in the database, and you might have chucked a chunk of stuff in, but I always like to look in the database if I can. It's one of the reasons I was having it on my own machine, because my SQL's all right, but it's rusty. And it's rusty partly because I use graphical tools to look into things. On the Mac, I was using something called Base, which is a cheapo SQL-like browser, and Base is fine, and it showed me all sorts of things that were going on in the data that I didn't find immediately useful, but it gave me a perspective on what was going on, what was escaped and what wasn't escaped, for instance, in the text. It let me watch the database as I added things and took things away in terms of the tasks that were done. It let me see what was happening at the tables in real time. So that's different to Alan's, in that Alan was controlling what went in. I was controlling my view of what had gone in, and that was something I found useful.
So Tony has chatted that he didn't create too much data. He looked at it from the view of just creating a to-do list, which he says got a bit boring because there was too many choices, tags, and options. And the benefit of automating is that you ignore a lot of the options because you're focused in on a certain area. So you use the manual exploratory stuff for all the variation and all the different options, but your automation tends to go down a much more channeled approach, and then you build on that over time. One thing I did experiment with the data, though, was I use proxy tools a lot. So one of the ways I used proxy tools is for generating HTTP requests. So I experimented with the API just by sticking messages in the proxy tool and sending them through. The GUI for that wasn't great, but what I did find a use for the proxy tools in terms of putting data in was Z-Attack Proxy has all the payloads that used to be in JBroFuzz, which is a fuzzing tool for having kind of payloads that cause security issues. So I was able to use those as input data into tracks, which exposed some problems. But because of the massive data that I was throwing in, it took me quite a long time to identify which data was really causing problems and which wasn't. So I had a lot less control over it because of the nature of the data, and because that type of data is really intended to really cause problems. I saw quite a lot of problems. What was interesting was Burp Suite, when it's parameterizing requests for fuzzing, you can have multiple parameters in place. So if you really want to if you don't want to do any coding for data setup, Burp Suite is very good for parameterizing your requests, because you can have multiple parameters in each payload. Z-Attack Proxy has a single slot for each variable, so it's good for very directed attacks or very directed data setup. But all of this was different options which were useful, but the ultimate most flexible option for me for data setup was custom Java code using Rest Assured as my REST API library. What other tools did people use?
GitHub, the project. No, I was thinking, because we had a lot of interesting, in the workshop we talked about the browser tools, and I found some interesting tools since, but I thought I was in and out. I've had a chat about a couple of tools, but I was in and out of GitHub all the time. Because in GitHub, shall I share my screen?
Let's try.
I can try, yeah. Actually, no, this probably isn't going to work. I might have it in the right place. So, GitHub, I would say put your hand up if you know what GitHub does, but we can't see you. There we are. Share screen. Share that one. So, hopefully you guys can now see yep, that looks right. I'm currently into GitHub. This is an open source project, so we can see the source. Here is the source. So that's nice, but that's not all we can see, because we can see if we hit history, we know that certain things changed over time. We can see when they changed. This happens to be something application controller underscore controller RB. Was one of the things that got highlighted to me because it had relatively low coverage. Coverage is very high in this application in most modules, but this one's got low coverage. I won't have a look at it. It's got commits that go on quite a lot. It seems to have the same few people in over time. Here we are back to April 2012, so there's 2 years worth of looking at in there. And we can also, if we go back to the code itself, if we hit blame, we can see who did what, or who touched what most recently. And I found that there was a particularly big bit that wasn't hit by coverage, and that when I went into the code to see when it was changed a couple of years ago. So there was a big code that was put into live code that didn't have any to newer stuff did. And then it turned out it was all, when you looked at blame, to do with one guy, one particular set of changes. And I'm in the wrong file to show you that, which is a shame. But it's still a very useful tool for me to get a view of exactly what is happening with this thing as a project, as a made thing. So that GitHub is my tool, and I enjoyed using GitHub for that. So it showed me a lot more than one would get if one just had the running application in front of you. To have the source and the history for that gives you an idea of what was going on. I think there's some interesting situations around that bit of code that, although it's in live, it doesn't have coverage, it doesn't have tests that go with it. It was all written in one chunk, it was all written by one guy, and weirdly, it's not in the production version. It's inaccessible. It's in the code, but it's accessible only if you've got the dev flag set. So there was that led me to find all the way down to some interesting stuff. But that's GitHub, and I wouldn't have been able to do that without GitHub, because I've been dealing with just an artifact in isolation of it from its history. GitHub gives you the artifact, its history, and its players. I really like that. That's my tool.
Interesting. I mean, you get used to looking at the code on agile projects. I mean, I take that for granted that we can do that now in pretty much any project. But I do remember projects I've worked on where we're not allowed to touch the code, and I was building a performance test tool for a company, and they wouldn't let me see the source, and they kept giving me jars that I had to use, and they were always out of date, and I had to reverse engineer it, and it was just horrible.
Yeah.
But I was reading your notes, James. Have you read James's notes, Steve or Tony?
No.
I'm not sure I've read my notes recently.
But what I found interesting was, because I didn't look at the code, but in your test notes you refer directly to the code where you were finding problems, you went and investigated it, you then had a much bigger insight into what you possibly need to do in that area, what would be completely irrelevant in that area because there's nothing to do with the code in that place. So that degree of insight is really useful at a certain point in the project where you're testing.
I dropped the ball. My intention was ultimately to write a test. I thought, yeah, it'd be really nice to write a test for this open source project, and I was that close and didn't do it. But yeah, that's kind of the direction I wanted to go in with that, is to know what was going right and what was going wrong, and to how to muck around with that. But as in this is what the thing is felt to be doing, and all the bits and pieces that lie behind that.
So did you actually use what you learnt by looking in GitHub to actually direct your testing at all?
Yes, and in the problem that you alerted Alan and I to, a big chunk of the diagnostic side was validated by looking at code, and then I didn't have to look at the application's behavior to get my next set of targets up. I just looked at the code. I ran something through the code that said, right, well, you and you and you and you and you are interesting targets, and the first one of those interesting targets I went and looked at had no problem. So looking at the code got me very swiftly to what the next problem was of a similar set. And I thought that was useful, and that it'd been easy to have written a test around that. It's broken in these places, and that would have been a nice thing to do, but I haven't done that. Actually, no, the unit test would have said it's broken in this place, and I'd have had to have put it in a couple of extra places for that.
So how about when you're just starting off on a new project and you didn't have like the seed like I gave you, what would you do then, having seen the history and who's done what? How can you use that to direct your testing?
I did a thing. I found a tool which I've not seen before called Rails Best Practices, which, I mean, just the title makes my toes curl. You got to try it. And it told me there were a bunch of things that were interesting in the code. I'm not sure I'd start with the code necessarily. I started with the structure of the application. I started with, this is where all the code is, and this is what it's trying to do, and then I looked at the structure of the data and the data entities, and then I looked at the tests and how they were structured. Then I found there was a coverage tool built in, so I looked at that, and I thought, actually the coverage here is pretty good. Most of the places, the bits that stick out with poor coverage, they're more interesting. So that was the kind of the direction I took. It wasn't that I could open up the code and say, aha, I have spotted a problem in code, somebody's used 1 equals when they meant 2. That wasn't what I was doing. But Ruby Best Practices reckoned it did. It reckoned it saw some stuff like that. But I didn't follow any of those things up Rails Best Practices, because I'm not a Rails guy. I don't know whether the Best Practices tool is in any way trustable or useful. And its messages were verbose and many, and I didn't understand all of what they meant. So I used my own cognizance there and ignored it.
So Tony has stuck a chat thing in saying that Alan Parkinson has a talk called Pull Requests and Testing Can Be Friends. So it might be worth looking to see if there's slides or stuff for that. Tony's going to have a look and see if he can find recording. Or we can ask Alan and find out. One thing that the blame functionality is useful for on projects is when people continue to make the same mistakes. And you can see who's checked in a bit of code and then check it for things that you think they very often do. And we've noticed that with the Rails apps that we've been testing. Because Rails is pretty much configuration over coding, people do make mistakes with the Rails app around relatively simple things which they just haven't quite configured. They haven't just taken that last leap to configure it to remove those problems.
Mm-hmm.
And I've noticed that on some projects that we're using Rails, you spend hours finding this bug, and then the developer fixes it in 3 seconds by tweaking a configuration somewhere. So it's worth us being aware of that kind of Rails best practices or Rails config that are available. So you made the most inroads into that on this thing, James.
Well, I think that there was that particular bug that Steve reported had a specific Rails command that is a relatively new Rails command and is just frequently misunderstood. It kind of says what it doesn't do. So if you had a Rails command that says reveal the big dog, what that would actually do is hide the small dog. And so lots of people are using it to reveal the big dog, but actually all they do is hide all the small dogs. And so it's a bit of a... That was an easy one to search for, because having known that mistake had been made in one place, it was this one command. Well, okay, it's used in these places. Those places look legitimate. These places, you know, it was very straightforward to do. And you know, the internet comes to your help. Comes to your help there. Stack Overflow is a lovely tool. I put the problem I was seeing into the internet. The internet led me to Stack Overflow, as it often does, and Stack Overflow says, "Yeah, this is a classic facepalm." And there we are. I probably should tell the guys on Traction, because I'm sure they know. I'm sure they know by now. But no, it's still in the code. I can actually see it.
The thing is, I mean, Tracks, like all the apps that we've looked at, does what it does really well. And as a single user app, any of the security issues we find are really not that important, because it's never going to go public. A lot of the bugs we found are never really going to interfere with a single person. No one is going to have the time to brain dump 800,000 tasks, so it's never going to slow down that much for a single user.
Yeah, no, I agree with it. But I'd be like Task Warrior, which was another. Weirdly, we've done two GTD apps, Task Warrior and GTD. It's a really good app. I might consider using it. It's not that we're finding bugs and isn't this rubbish. It's finding bugs and they're not just popping out. They take some finding. And clearly it's got a user base, and the user base are using it happily and continue to use it, and it's a nice thing. I like Tracks. So yeah, it's not. It's a bit of a cliche to talk about a target-rich environment. It's definitely got its problems, and if you know where to look, then the problems are many. But it's not dismal. It's not been written badly. It's not a dead project, and it's not got no users. It's got thousands of users. It's got thousands of commits. I'm just looking. It's got 3,000 separate individual commits to code. You know, it's an active thing that is going on. Last change made to the project was 1 day ago, which fixed a particular bug. You know, so it's active. Yeah. Now I'm looking to see what the fix was. Stop doing that. Don't play in GitHub, Jack.
So Tony has chatted that Alan Parkinson has a SlideShare account. So if you go to slideshare.net/Alan_Parkinson, then you'll find his slides, and then you should be able to find the pull requests and testers can be friends deck there. So I will be reading that later on.
Yeah, I'll rattle over there. See whether yeah, because GitHub is lovely. Anyway.
So have you got anything else in your notes, Steve, that you have to eat and burn after we finish?
No, it depends which way the conversation goes. I wrote a bunch of stuff, but it's not important. So.
Yeah, you weren't here for that bit, James.
Oh, okay.
Actually, I don't know whether we want to talk about it, but some of the testing revealed interesting things going on with the Ajax, where the front end and back end weren't talking to each other very well. So, for instance, you might get an error message even though in the front end, even though everything happened fine at the back end, and I did wonder if there's anything tool-based that can be done to investigate that. I didn't use really any tools apart from curl, and because I've got a ton of things I can do manually, and some of those manual tests revealed these weirdnesses, and it happened in both ways, where sometimes an error occurred, but there's no error message. Other times there's an error message even though an error didn't occur, because the front end was making its own decisions about whether things are right, and so was the back end, and they weren't in sync. And I have no idea if there are tools that can help with this, or techniques that where you can sort of somehow sit in the middle and see what's going on a bit more than I can through the UI.
So what I use for that, we've got the inbuilt dev tools. Right, and what they're useful for with Ajax, I find, is sometimes the Ajax errors are down to JavaScript issues. So you'll find in the JavaScript consoles the error message being shown from those JavaScript calls. So sometimes it's just really obvious, but only if you look in the dev tools. On some sites that I've worked on, I use proxy tools all the time. But with the proxy tools, you can see the Ajax request going through, and sometimes you'll see an error message coming back that the front end just isn't rendering. And I've seen this on sites that I use routinely in the real world, and you see people in the forums going, why is this happening? I can't understand. And I can see the error message, so I know what's going on, and then I can go under the covers and deal with things. But most people can't see these workarounds. So I use proxy tools for that. Anytime I'm doing Ajax, I always stick a proxy in the middle because it's the easiest way of me seeing it. But I need to get the JavaScript console up as well to see the error messages, just in case it's code-based error messages, because someone's tested it on Firefox and then you get an error message on Chrome because they're not using an Ajax library and they've handcrafted it.
So it's good to mention the dev tools there in the browsers, because I mean everything that turns up in your browser is effectively public. You know, there's no privacy once it's been sent to your browser. So if you are writing something that then gets sent to a browser, that's not private, as people with little laptops might come across with their certificates. So we turned on the dev tools, and it seemed that some people knew the dev tools really well, and some people going, oh, that's good, I can do that. So if there's one thing that came out of this is turn on the dev tools. You know, just having console to log, you know, things logging stuff to console, stuff saying this is an error, is really handy. I know some of you know I do a bit of Flash from time to time. It's interesting how I just didn't use the console because, of course, I'm in Flash. Then I started logging stuff up to the console, and loads of things turn up there that don't turn up in my normal debugging. So yeah, it's a great thing to have, and the Safari DevTools have got things like profilers, and so you can see what's loading up, and if something's coming in a bit slow, if something goes asynchronous, and it goes before or after the other thing, and so it's a handy set of tools to get familiar with. I think we sent round a note including a bunch of references, and one of those was that Apple has quite a big manual for the Safari DevTools, and I'm sure there is one for Chrome and Firefox as well. Well, for Firebug rather than for Firefox DevTools.
So I'm not sure if Chrome does, because every new release of Chrome has some new functionality snuck in that no one notices for ages. Or they've moved some things around and you can't find. I mean, they've got a dev site, it could well be on there, it's just that I don't keep up to date enough with it.
No.
But
yes.
Everyone should learn how to use it, simply because a lot of forms that you have to fill in on the internet in order to get free stuff, if you look in the form, chances are the thing you want is already linked there, and you don't actually have to fill in your details.
Yay, and spam reduction techniques from Alan.
So is there any other business that we need to cover? Because I've now covered my notes pretty much, I think. Oh, notes. So how did everyone get on looking at their test notes? Did they make sense a month and a half later?
Mine did, surprisingly. Although I found there was very little about the planning and thinking. A lot about what I did retrospectively after I'd done it, but looking back, I can't see any of my thought processes, and that is something I've got to work on a lot better, because that would give me insights into what I thought I could do and then didn't have time to do or chose not to do. And with what I've got, it's much harder to go back and build on what I did before. I don't start from scratch again, so that's very much a lesson learnt for me.
I keep my notes in Scrivener, which is a writer's tool. And I think it's the first time I've been back to the Scriv notes on something that I did in this way. So I tested this for, I think I did 8 hours over a period of a couple of weeks. So I was fairly familiar with going backwards and forwards, and Scriv allows you to have various different hierarchies. Normally I'd use an outliner, but I found outliners were particularly difficult to read, so I was pleased with what I recalled from Scrivener. So the best way for me to trigger my memory is to look at handwriting. I didn't have any handwritten notes this time, but Scriv had enough in it that was formatted interestingly and differently to trigger the visual memories. The organisation and hierarchy and timestamping helped me remember some about the various different directions I'd gone in and why I'd gone in them, because I do try to, if I've made a decision that I'm clear on is a decision, I'll try and write it down. So that was good. It was interesting looking at the difference between the notes that I'd done to keep me on track, because I test better when I've got notes, and the notes that I wrote for the, I did a 2-hour bit of testing where I kept some demonstration notes in some ways, because I know I didn't want to show everybody how much pain I'd been having with Docker, for instance, but it was good to show people how much testing I'd done. And that set of notes, weirdly, those are the ones I didn't read. I just read the summary at the top and the conclusions at the bottom. And then went to the points in those notes which were much more hierarchically organised, much more outline focused in those. So I found that the ones I'd done for consumption were more easily summarisable and more easily navigatable. So I didn't use them. Because I could navigate through them. I looked at some and thought, yes, checked up those things. And I've got a feeling there's a bunch of things in there that I'm remembering now that I would have liked to have gone back and had a look at before we started this. So I've kind of obscured them for myself.
So that means I've only seen your public ones.
You've only seen the public ones,
yeah. But what is interesting is, I mean, I do that summary as well. So I do all my testing, and I go through it and look for important points, and then I create a summary section at the top. And very often what I'll do is I'll look through my notes and pull out any actions or outstanding questions and stick them at the bottom, so that I've got 2 sections that I revisit. And one of them which is stable because it's a summary at the top, but one of them which then I move from the bottom of this document into the top of the next document because it's the next set to do things. And timestamps are really important. But also I noticed in your public logs, James, you do, what I thought was great was you put in all the commands that you used. I do that as well in mine, and pasting in the results. It makes this so much easier to recreate because you can copy and paste the commands through. But also having description around it for, I'm about to try and think about this thing. So the thoughts about what you might do, Steve. I mean, I do try and put those in. But I try and type really fast. I type as much stuff in there as I can, and I'm jumping back and forwards to it. So at the moment you can see my head moving around because I've got a screen here, a screen here, a screen here, my laptop down here. I've got a tablet in front of me. So I've got things everywhere that I'm constantly monitoring and using and looking around. So I get used to jumping between windows, typing stuff in.
The thing I always struggle with is whether to record stuff chronologically, and there's times when you want that, and then other times you want stuff ordered in sort of outline form by sort of category of some kind. And I've never found a way to sort of meet the 2 of those requirements. It'd be nice to have some sort of database thing that you can actually push a button and it sorts it by category and then sort it by sort of chronology. I don't know if anyone's got any techniques for doing that sort of thing.
I think something I've been looking for myself is effectively an outliner that where your leaves are what the bits at the very end, which has got information in. They are what they are, but the ordering and the hierarchy, you can have lots of different orderings and hierarchies. And obviously, by time would be one, and thematically would be another. And tags would be great to do that. And I've tried to do that with Scrivener, and I've tried to do it with Tinderbox on the Mac. And neither of them have really done what I want them to do. But Scrivener is the current favourite because it's not as much of a pig's ear as Tinderbox, which I will go out my way and say I've spent money on that, and I'll probably spend money on it again. It's but Scrivener's got this sense of a binder with leaves in, and you can have multiple binders but the same leaves, so you can reorder your notes in various different ways using different binders, and I find that useful for other things than testing. I've not yet done it with testing. And I don't know why, because I did set out to use Scrivener in that way. And I think that although it feels like a need, perhaps it isn't something that I've really found a purpose for. It feels like I need it, but because I've not done it, I'm suspicious of that need. If you see what I mean?
Yeah. So I mean, I tend
but
to,
no, Scrivener can do it.
Yeah. So I tend to create everything time-based, and I will add the summary and notes at the bottom. I don't know if James, you were at one of the companies I worked for a while when we were doing notes, and I don't know if you used the metadata parser that I wrote for the exploratory testing. So one thing that we did was we wrote our notes, and we tagged them with the story that we're working on at a certain time, and so we had this time-based set of notes, and I got all the text files, put them through a batch processor, then it automatically went into Jira in the right places to have the logs, because people don't work on a single story for all the time, but over the course of a day they'll work on a story, then another story, then they'll jump back to another story, and copy and pasting all this stuff into Jira was a pain, so I automated that. The other tool that is useful out of the box that does these things is called Leo, which is it's a fairly old tool now. It's designed for literate programming, but it lets you create custom leaves, tag them, use them in different places, output them to different files at different points in time. So that might be useful. But I think, like James said, it's something that we think we need, but in reality we tend not to.
I'd love to have it going. I've just bought Leo up. That looks really interesting. So it's leoeditor.com for those of you who are wondering what Anne's talking about. Yeah, so it's people talk about it. I'll leave that. Yeah, I'll have a look at it later. But leoeditor.com.
A complicated tool. I worked with it for a while, but essentially I didn't need it, and because what I do is I create these linear notes. If I need anything complicated, I will tag them with macros, and I will just write a batch processor to go through and extract the data from the files that I need.
Yeah, I'm a visual person, and certainly with both Tinderbox and Scrivener, the option of being able to put things into clusters, and they'll say you're all this thing, you're all this thing, and to do it automatically and to do it by tag, it's very attractive, and I really want it, and I've never got it working to my satisfaction, and I'm not sure I'd use it if I did, because when I do want to do that stuff, I'll draw a picture with a pencil, which is just a much richer medium than something which I've tried to code.
Yeah. And what's worse now is all the tools that I use now for drawing pictures are now a bit of paper and a smartphone to take a photograph of it. I don't use any diagrammers anymore. The more things advance, the less advanced I become.
I've been hitting my head on the spike of Omnigraphel for the last day, so yeah, don't get me started with diagrammers. They don't talk to each other properly. Bloody anyway. So for Copenhagen Context, which is coming up in a few days' time, we'll see if I go there with any useful tool, whether I do it exactly as Alan says and say I'm going to have 100 people in a room and a bit of paper and a squiggly marker. So we'll see how we go.
And because I even wrote a small script to clean up the pictures using, I think it's on GitHub, so to clean up the whiteboard photos and things, because I couldn't be bothered buying a tool, and all this stuff is free now.
Yeah, and
is there any other business?
Cheap, so you don't have to worry about. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. Any other business? We
So
have
somebody in mind is gone, so no. It's probably worth saying that you'll have noticed if you're listening that we have lots of things that we're not quite talking about. Those people who came on the workshop, they have all our notes and they know where the problems were that we found. They know how we found them or what we found. They certainly found plenty themselves. And so there's a lot of sharing that went on in the workshop, but we're holding that back from you because we're teasing.
No, we're not. It's called marketing. It's not called teasing.
Sorry. Marketing. We're marketing. That's the word. Yes. So yeah, do we know a date for the next one?
And we said, I can't remember what it was.
At the moment when Tony says yes, it's this date.
I think Tony's still looking for venues, so we're not confirmed yet. However, if anyone urgently wants to do it early, then they could bring us into their organisation and we could do this workshop for them.
Yes, we can. It's been out 3 times so far. London Tester Gathering was one, Agile Testing Days was another one, and then this most recent one in January in London was the 3rd. It's good fun. I don't know whether you'd get all of us, but you'd certainly get some of us, and we'd be doing real live testing with real live software, and you'd see how we worked, and we'd sit down and work directly with you. That's what this is about.
So that's commercial plug number 1. Oh, look at that! Tony's got a big beach bubble.
Maybe you could see this. Yeah.
Where did that go? That was brilliant.
It's gone away.
Yes, I don't know if our audience can see that.
Apparently, sometime in September we might be doing this in public. Also on the chat system, Rob Lambert or Dell is saying that Rob Lambert suggested using Evernote and a mind mapper, who the name you can't remember. So the mind mapper I use is MindMeister. People seem to be using Goiko's one a lot. What's Goiko's one called?
MindMup.
MindMup. Yep.
Yeah, it's got its problems, but it's so shareable and so simple. Yeah.
Which I think Rob might have been talking about. I use Evernote for all my notes, and I use MindMeister whenever I'm doing any mind maps. But MindMup seems very popular at the moment, and it's free mostly. There's advanced functionality you can pay for.
Very shareable. You can just it's like a Google Doc, but for a mind map. It's dead easy. So yeah, we like it. And
it's compatible with FreeMind and MindMeister and all these things. You can now move mind maps between tools really easily because everyone uses the FreeMind format, which is useful.
Mm-hmm. So yes.
So does anyone have anything else they want to plug?
Yeah. I want to. I've got a 2-day getting a grip on exploratory testing thing coming up. It's 2 days. It's all hands-on. The exercises are mainly made to give you positive learning experience, and that is in April the 14th and 15th. I think you'll find that on my website. And I've got another 2 in July. As a big plug. Currently it's on early bird, and not only early bird, if you go to my website and you find my sign up for my mailing list page, I'll give you the 50 quid off. 50 quid! That's it.
Wow.
So I'll make sure it's on the front page.
And the attendee
the next half hour or so.
Yeah, and the attendee list just plummeted down at that point. No one.
Yeah, people don't like being sold things. Sorry. I should have a look at that, shouldn't I? There we are.
So my other business is that we're currently looking for great testers to join us, contract or perm, manual or automation. If you're really brilliant, get in touch.
And how would they do that? Would that be testpartners.com? What is it?
That would be steve.green@testpartners.co.uk, or fill in the form on our website. Everything comes through to me.
And remember, all these links are available on blackopstesting.com in the About section. You've got links for all of us. So I would just say, I'm finishing the Java for Testers editing at the moment, so at the end of this month there should be a new updated version of that out, and I will probably up the price from its mighty $4.99 minimum price at the moment to probably maybe $7.50. I'm going to ramp against that.
Gouge them out.
Tony, have you got anything you want to try and static across the internet? No, and that's probably just as well. Right, I think we're done then. That was fun. Hope that was useful for people. If there's anything in the chats, we'll try and address it on the website or something. But goodbye from me. Everyone else?
Cheerio, everybody. We'll stick around with the chat for a minute or two longer in case stuff comes in. All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.